Welcome to Pumping Python. My name is Jacob Itegbuje. This video covers data structures, specifically none. None is an object that is used to represent the absence of a value. I'm going to create a test file named test.none.py, which will hold my tests. Add some boilerplate, import unit test, class test, none, unit test case. Just add a test that says test none is none. I'm going to add an assert statement, so the assert is not none, which checks if an object is not none. In this case, none is definitely none, so the test fails, and I change the assert statement to assert is none. Assert is none checks that the object given is none. From the tests, I can see that none is none. I'm going to add another test, this time to find out is none a Boolean. Test is none a Boolean. Just so that assert is none true. True is a Boolean. We know false is also a Boolean. Say false. The test fails. It says true is not none, so I change it to assert is not none. True is definitely not none, and assert is not none for false. Same thing, false is not none. The bool class is how we represent Booleans or objects that are Boolean inherit from the bool class. So I'm going to do an instance test with assert is instance to check if none is a Boolean. The test shows me none is not an instance of class bool, so I change the test using assert not as instance. From the test, I can see that none is not a Boolean and none is none. Let's add another test. There are other Python objects that I want to see if none is equal to any of the other data types in Python. I want to know, is none an int? Is it a float? Is none a string? Is none a tuple? Is none a list? Is none a set or is none a dict? Let's add a test for if none is an integer. Is none an integer? Self.assert is none, and say -1 for negative numbers, or negative integers 0. Self.assert is none 1. The test shows me -1 is not none, and so I say assert is not none. Do the same thing for 0 is not none, and 1 is not none. We can also do an instance test here. Is instance int is how integers are represented in Python. And the test shows me none is not an instance of the int class. And I say assert not as instance. From the test, I can see that none is not an integer, none is not a Boolean, none is none. Let's add another test, this time for floating point decimals. So say is none a float? Test is none a float? So assert is none -1.2 to represent negative floating point numbers. Assert is none 0.2 to represent positive floating point numbers. And the terminal shows me -1.2 is not none, so I say assert is not none -1.2, 0.2 assert is not none. And the test passes. I add an instance test as well. Assert is none. Float is instance. Float is how we represent floating point decimals in Python, or the class that they inherit from. None is not an instance of the class float, so I say assert not is instance. And I see from the test that none is not a float, none is not an integer, none is not a bool, is not a Boolean, none is none. Let's add another test, this time for a tuple. Test is none a tuple. Self.assert is none, and an empty tuple. Parenthesis is how we represent tuples in Python. And then I say self.assert is none. I do one that has some stuff in it, 1, 2, 3, and then add an instance test. Self.assert is instance none a tuple. Tuple is the class that tuples inherit from. See, for the first case, none is not a tuple, so assert is not none. For the second case, assert is not none, and the test moves on, and assert not is instant, tuple. I had another test here, say a test is non a string. So strings are any characters that are inside quotes. It could be single quotes, double quotes, triple single quotes, or triple double quotes. I had a test for the empty string, and then I'm going to do one for a string that has characters inside it. And add an instance test is instance non-string. str is the class that represents strings. For the first case where it's an empty string, it's not non, so I say assert is a not non. And for the second case, it's not non as well, and non is not an instance of a string, so I say assert not is instance of the string class. From the test, I see that none is not a string, none is not a tuple, none is not a float, none is not an integer, none is not a boolean, none is none. Let's add a test for list. A test is not a list. Self.assert is none. Square brackets is how we represent lists, so that's an empty list. Assert is none, is one that has things in it. And the instance test. So it is instance non-list. For the first case, I see the empty list is not none. Second case where it has things in it, it's also not none. And none is not an instance of the list class, so I say assert not is instance. From the test, I see that none is not a list, none is not a string, none is not a tuple, none is not a float, none is not an integer, none is not a boolean, none is none. Let's add another test, this time for a set. The find test is non a set. Self.assert is non an empty set. And here's one is non a set that has things in it. And is it an instance of the set class? The terminal shows set non is not none, sorry. So I changed the test, I said it's not none. For the one that has things in it, it's not none as well, and it's not an instance of the set class. From the test, I see that none is not a set, it's not a list, it's not a string, it's not a tuple, it's not a float, it's not an integer, it's not a boolean, it is none. One more test, let's say test is non a dictionary. Self.assert is non, I say dict to represent an empty dictionary. Self.assert is non, the dictionary that has things in it. This one, key 1, value 1, key 2, value 2, key 3, value 3. Add another one for good measure, key n, value n, and then the instance test. Assert is instance, non. The class to represent dictionaries is dict. The terminal shows me that the empty dictionary represented by curly braces is not none. Curly braces is also how we represent sets. The difference is that sets don't have key value pairs, dictionaries have key value pairs. Change the test, assert is not none for the empty dictionary, and the dictionary that has things, assert is not none, and none is not an instance of the dictionary class, so I say assert not is instance. From the tests, I see that none is not a dictionary, none is not a set, none is not a list, none is not a string, none is not a tuple, none is not a float, none is not an integer, none is not a boolean, none is none. There you have it. Now you know what none is and what none is not. Have a good one. See you in the next video.